Welcome everyone to the Brand Fortress HQ podcast and another Amazon Tactics Tuesday. Today we're actually going to be talking about something a little bit different. This is a follow up to a previous episode where we talked about really stepping into wholesale in brick and mortar, and so this is one of the things that is another opportunity when we look at fortifying your brand. Yes, Amazon is a great platform and a great way to sell in e-commerce, but as building up that reputation, one of the things that it also gives you is the ability to branch out into other channels. And one of those channels is wholesale. So today, I'm going to actually hand it over to Mike to give us a little bit of update on a previous episode that we did on his journey that he's going through in looking at wholesale.
Yeah, so we actually had another conversation just yesterday with the company that we're trying to get on the shelves of. It's Leslie's Pool Stores. We sell, in case anybody hasn't seen previous episodes, we sell pool cleaning tools. It's an unlimited free lifetime replacement of anything we sell. That's the warranty. And so we have been trying to get on Leslie's shelves actually for quite a long time. I've contacted them multiple times. I have an not assistant. She's actually my inventory manager, but she has, in a previous life, she worked for another company where she actually worked, procuring, retail accounts to get on the shelf at these retail stores and whatnot. So she had some experience. She was trying to get a hold of Leslie's, never really happened. So we ended up, so this might be the first piece of advice that I have for anybody. And that is, we ended up hiring an agency that does this. Like, that's all they do, is they get brands onto the shelves of retail stores. And it's not cheap, but I would say at the same time, if we manage to get on the shelf here at Leslie's, it will have been well worth it. I mean, easily it'll be worth the price that we paid. And so just kind of getting back to what happened. So our initial conversation was probably, I don't know, well, it was actually just after I got to Puerto Rico. So it's been 7 weeks ago about. And that first conversation we had was with the head buyer for Leslie's, who indicated that he was very interested. At the end of that call, he said, we're almost positive that we want to move forward with this. We'll be getting back to you, yada, yada. And it took 7 weeks for us to actually move to what we considered to be the next stage. And we were supposed to get the vendor docs because we have to fill out, a whole bunch of documentation. There's a bunch of requirements that we have to be able to meet in order to actually sell to them. One of the things that we're going to have to do is increase the limits on the insurance that we have. So Amazon requires that you have a certain level of business insurance. Leslie's is going to require that we have a stronger level and that we add them to it. So they're covered, in terms of selling our products. So that's something that we'll have to work through. But interestingly, this conversation, interestingly and frustratingly, this conversation ended up really being a repeat of the first conversation, because what happened was the head buyer who we met with last time passed this off to the next guy in line, who's under him, and he handles the subcategory that we're in. And the conversation, we really had to run through pretty much all the same things that we ran through in that first conversation in terms of trying to quell any fears fears, over the lifetime warranty and some of those things. Making the pitch for why it's a benefit to them. So at least for us, this lifetime unlimited replacement, one of the things about a retail shop, of course, is most of the time they're looking for products that they can sell over and over again. And pool rakes and brushes and poles and that sort of thing. That is exactly that kind of a product. It's not technically a consumable, but they generally wear out within, a couple of seasons and somebody's back to buy another one. So offering a product that has an unlimited free replacement warranty is a little bit scary on their side. But the argument that we made is essentially, well, if you do it right, you'll have them coming back, because what we'll do is we'll have them come to you for the warranty replacements. You can actually do parts replacements for people. So instead of them having to contact us and maybe wait, 4 or 5 or 6 days for the product to show up, they can just walk into a Leslie's and an hour later, or less, they've got, their item either repaired with a new part or they've got the new item. And so, they have a way to get that person back into the store regularly, and they can still sell other items to them. And certainly the markup on our product is going to be good. So that was a little frustrating that we're kind of running through that conversation again, but there still seems to be a fair amount of interest. We'll see where it goes and whether we get on the shelf. But Leslie's has 1,000 stores across the U.S. And so one of the things that we're looking at, just to kind of give a little bit of big picture here. So we sell right now, we're at about 5 million in revenue. We're hoping that we can manage to hit 10 million in revenue this year. But 5 million was last year. So the interesting thing is that selling on Amazon, anybody I would imagine probably recognizes how much our profit margins are coming down as we're selling on the platform, just because fees continue to climb, competition continues to grow. And so what used to be, we would oftentimes sell, after all expenses, we might have a 30% profit margin, across the board, whereas now we're about 15%, which is not horrible. It's not terrific, but it's not horrible. But going to Leslie's, the interesting thing is that the price point that we sell at, because we sell at about 5 times our COGS, slightly more than that in some cases, but roughly 5 times our COGS, we actually have enough margin that we can offer the discount that the retailer is going to want in order to put us on the shelf. Now, every category probably is a little different. Every store maybe is a little different, but in the case of Leslie's, we're offering if they were purchasing at the high end, in terms of the volume tiers that we set up in terms of pricing, they would receive about a 45% discount off of retail. What's neat about that though is if they place $1 million order with us, which is essentially $1,000 of product per store, which is hardly anything, right? So if they place $1 million order with us, we would actually make about $550,000 on that order. Now, looking at that from a percentage standpoint, I mean, that's massive. We're over 50% in terms of what we would make on that sale. And once we've got the account, it's just more or less taking orders, right? So it's so much easier, than trying to work Amazon. And the profit margin is considerably more. But the only reason that that's true is because of the margins that we already have built into our product. And so I would say, if you want to get on retail, make sure you're not starting out with a product that has a really slim margin, because they're going to want a pretty significant discount off your retail price. And if you're going to give them that discount, you got to still make money on it. So if you want retail, you got to have the margin.
Yeah, a couple of things that I heard you say that I just want to kind of double click on. The first is that just where your brand is at, I think, really helps open that door. So brands that may be, kind of low to mid 6 figures. First of all, finding an agency to help you get into brick and mortar is a great idea, because they've got all the, they've got a good shop's got a lot of connections. They understand how to pitch your product in a way that the buyers are going to want to hear, and those types of things. But if you're on the smaller end, you're probably not ready for brick and mortar yet, because most of those agencies that are good are not going to take you until you're at least mid 6 figures, if not 7 figures, just because there's not enough, the product isn't proven enough. There's not enough meat on the bone. There's a number of different reasons why a good agency, in a lot of cases, won't take products that are super early. So that's the one thing I think, just for people that are listening, to keep in mind. And then the other one is, really thinking about, and I just want to, foot stomp that piece on the margins, which is, if you've got slim margins on Amazon and you don't have enough margin already built into your product, like you said, wholesale can be fantastic. But those, there's, depending on what category your product is in, you not only have, the retailer that you're selling it to that wants a discount, because of course they've got to make money, but you may also have a distributor in there as well that is going to take another, 15 to 25%. So you do need to make sure that you've got some healthy margins in order to do that. And depending, again, on the category, it may be a matter of I get that margin by having so much more volume, because if I'm selling $1 million worth of that product, I'm able to put in a much larger order with my manufacturer, and I may be able to negotiate with that manufacturer to say, hey, if I put in an order for 100,000 units instead of my regular 10,000 units, can you bring down the price enough in order to, for me as the business to maintain my margin level, while at the
Right.
same time giving a chunk to the retailer and possibly even the distributor to kind of make everybody happy. So there's some different ways to work that. But I think at the end of the day, um, being closer to that seven figures in a lot of cases, at least when you start looking at the bigger brick and mortar, is where you're probably going to see more success. If you're at, 50,000 or 100,000, annual revenue on a handful of products, going the brick and mortar route might be very challenging.
Yeah. Yeah. I would say it's, the other thing that you mentioned, in terms of like negotiating with your supplier. And I think one other piece to pay attention to is, and to be honest, it hadn't even occurred to me until just this moment. And that is that you could be in a position where you can negotiate down your price across the board for whatever product you're buying from them, because if you can, depending on how much you might be able to increase your volume. I mean, it's possible, it's actually very possible, if this deal with Leslie's goes well, it might not be year one, but maybe year two, or so, it's possible we could be looking at $2 or $3 million orders, or at least seasons for sure, with Leslie's. And so when you look at that, the amount of volume that could add to our overall annual volume in terms of what we're purchasing from a supplier would be significant. And so you might be able to go to the supplier and say, hey, I'd like an across the board discount on everything that I buy because my overall volume is so high, which means then you've got better margin on your Amazon sales too. So, moving into retail does open up a lot of doors. The other thing that we're looking at that I think is going to be super helpful to us is that, when you get into retail, you hit, number one, a brand new market of a lot of people who maybe don't do a whole lot of buying online and buy mostly maybe locally. But at the same time, you are going to get people who are going into the local store, seeing your product there and doing brand searches for you online, which is going to increase your brand search on Google. It's going to increase your brand search on Amazon, which overall, should improve your rankings, to some degree. It's difficult to say to how much, but it can't hurt, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, that's when I ran a CPG brand, how, I looked at it was any product that I could get on the shelf. Like, yeah, I want to make money on that product, but at the same time, it's also free advertising.
Yeah.
Because somebody might see that product on the shelf, and then, either they pick it up at the store for that first buy, and maybe after that they order off of Amazon because they want to get it in 2 days. They don't want to stop by the store,
Right.
or what, or they're like, hey, this thing is amazing, and they recommend it to their brother, mother, cousin, whatever it happens to be. And it makes it easy for them to just, buy it off of Amazon because maybe they don't have that store, nearby where that family member or friend lives. So, yeah, I mean, it is a good source of advertising as well. I am curious. So one of the things, and, steer me in a different direction if you're not quite ready to talk about this piece of it yet. But I am curious about the logistics piece of it, because one of the things that's tricky in the CPG world, especially when you're talking about food products, is there's a couple of dominant players, especially within distribution. And quite frankly, they won't tell you what your finalized price is for moving product. And so it can be very hard for brands because, they might quote you a price, but then they'll be like, well, if it doesn't sell, then you got to buy it back. And, if
Right.
we don't have the truck space and it ends up staying in our warehouse for an extra 30 days, we charge you for that. And there's just a lot of other charges that you end up getting nickeled and dimed to death. And I've definitely known some brands that, they sell $1 million, multi-million dollars in brick and mortar, and they essentially break even on that. And they make money off of their own website and Amazon because of all the
Right.
nickel and diming from some of the distributors out there that are just, especially the bigger ones, that can be absolutely brutal to mom and pop businesses.
Yeah, for
Well,
sure.
to add to that,
So
Mike, and I'm curious from your standpoint, you said that your margins were better or would be better in this wholesale type of an arrangement. But what is your cost in terms of fulfillment? Is that also less because you're fulfilling an order, a PO basically, to a wholesale supplier? Like there's less moving pieces to that type of product that you're selling to them, right? So your margins are
Yeah,
better at the bottom line, but is it also less work to get it to them?
it depends on the scenario. So for with this particular account, at least everything that we know thus far suggests that they're willing to simply take a volume shipment directly to their distribution warehouse, and then they'll send it out from there. However, Pool Corp is another company that we have had conversations with them, and we're actually going to sit down with them again, hopefully, fingers crossed. But our previous conversation was one in which essentially they wanted us to individually work with their stores. So we weren't taking one single volume order. We were having to deal with the individual stores themselves. And logistically, that was just never going to work. There was no way we were going to do that. We don't have the manpower for it. It wasn't worth it. So I would say, we've only dealt with two retailers, so I can't say what would be the most common scenario. But I can say that we have seen both scenarios as options. And for us, the only one that made sense was volume shipment to a distribution warehouse, which fortunately it sounds like Uzzies is open to do. So, that's kind of where we are right now. But back to something that John was mentioning a second ago. So one of the things that, and I won't mention the brand, but there's another brand that we're looking at doing a partnership with. And I've been speaking to them about basically having a dual branded product. So it's going to be their product sold under a dual branded scenario where their brand and our brand is on it. And it's going to be rebadged. It's going to be in our colors and whatnot. And it'll have the lifetime warranty because it's a patented product. And we would like to be able to sell it to the portion of our customer base that wants it. But because it's patented, we're going to do this dual branding scenario. But back to the point is that they also sold to Leslie's in the past, and they ended up having to pull back out of that scenario because they couldn't, the margins weren't big enough and the terms weren't good enough. So in other words, the deal that they had negotiated, they didn't have the margin that they thought. And my guess would be, John, that part of the reason for that is probably because some of those additional components came into play that maybe they weren't considering or didn't expect to be as big an expense as it was. And so like returns and product that didn't sell or, things like that. And so their margins were just razor thin. And then to top it off, it was 90-day terms. And so, at that point they were bringing in from China. And so, it was killing them because they didn't have 90-day terms with their manufacturer, of course, but they were, but Leslie's had 90-day terms with them. And so they didn't have the cash flow that they needed. So finally they just stopped. And so it's another reason why I'm going to continue to just holler this as much as I can. And that is, make sure you've got good margins before you ever pursue this direction, because, volume is great, but when your margins are razor thin like that, it doesn't take much to topple, a business that's dealing on, razor thin margins. But if you've got large margins, then you've got room to wiggle. You've got room so that if some of those things happen, you've got product that doesn't sell or whatever, you can afford to cover that if you have to. You might even be able to accept 90-day terms, and still pull it off. I would also say, make sure though, that you've done all that you can to get better terms out of your suppliers, or that you're using some of these new services that give you an opportunity to pay suppliers with a credit card or on financing or something, so that you can back that payment off, say for 60 days or so, rather than having to pay at the point of shipment.
Yeah, and I would really encourage people to listen to the episode with Ben Leonard, because he actually goes pretty in depth on negotiating with your suppliers and has some amazing tips in there. So from that perspective, I'd encourage listeners to go back to that episode and listen to his tips there, because he had some really good information on how to negotiate with those suppliers. The other thing I would be curious, because some of this is, from my previous experience with this, when you're working with any sort of supplier, what I recommend is, or buyer, I mean, you're kind of vetting them just as much as they're vetting you.
Yeah.
Um, so really make sure that you pay attention to, all the fine print, because otherwise you could end up in a situation where, like you said, not only do you have 90-day terms on the product that sells, but then you end up, if product doesn't sell for some reason, then, now you paid not only to get it to that retailer, they sat on it for, you know, 3, 6 months or whatever, and now you've got to essentially pay to ship that product back to you. Then you got to figure out how to liquidate it and refund that big retailer, et cetera, et cetera.
Right.
It can get pretty messy. And so the other thing that I would just encourage, folks that are interested in going down this route is having that discussion with the buyer, saying, hey, what does success look like for a brand on your shelf? Like, how many units, based on our price point, do you expect that we'd be selling in a week or a month? What do successful brands do in order to kind of launch their product in your stores? Because the other thing is that, having that relationship with them is really important to getting that information up front, so that way you can be successful. Because I will say that the only thing, getting into stores is great, but it is a whole nother ball game to stay on the shelf and actually have that product sell through. And you do, I think we talked about this in the last episode, but you do want to make sure that you have a plan in place to promote that, within a retailer, just like you would launching a new product on Amazon.
Right.
Because, if, like you said, it's fantastic if you've got customers that are now buying from that retailer where essentially it's mailbox money, once you kind of figure out
Right.
that to get that product to move on the shelf. But if it doesn't, in a lot of cases, that retailer is not going to give you a second chance.
Yeah.
And sometimes just having, a handful of ideas of how you're going to launch the product and how you're going to promote it to get that initial traction is enough to be successful in that retail environment, to really sustain that your brand. So that way you can have that as a reliable additional sales channel.
So Mike, it feels like this type of going this route is very relationship based. And I think that after that first call that you had with the senior buyer or the head of buying, you said it went really well. But then you had another meeting with a more junior buyer that was more specifically in that subcategory. Do you think that there's anything that you could have done differently in that first meeting to either mitigate the risk of having to repeat yourself to someone else, or like any lessons that you learned in that process that maybe could have made that process a little bit better for you and for them, not having to go through the same thing twice?
I don't know if there's anything that we necessarily could have done in the first meeting to have avoided that scenario. But what I would say is, A, recognize that's a possibility. It hadn't even occurred to me that that was a likelihood, that we would end up in that scenario. B, once you realize that that's the scenario, and we technically knew that we were getting passed off to the more junior buyer, probably 3 weeks ago. I would say that at that point, it would have been to my benefit, most likely, to try and make more direct connection with that buyer prior to this call, and maybe make sure that he was up to speed on what had already been discussed. What we'd kind of outlined in that conversation. Whatever. That probably would have helped to speed this process along, instead of basically kind of repeating that conversation again. Recognize that there's a chance that you run into a scenario where the senior buyer has been with Leslie's for quite a long time. This junior buyer has been with them for about a year, and I mean, he seems like a good guy. He's been a buyer for someone for quite a long time, so he knows the game. Like, he's not a rookie, but he is a rookie with Leslie's. And so that kind of, it does box you into a corner a little bit, as the buyer, because you kind of feel like you have to be really, really careful, like your job's kind of on the line. You bring on a product like this that's, again, it's a lifetime guarantee. That's a different kind of a product than what they normally sell. So he's got to really dot his I's and cross his T's. So it's going to be a process, walking through that. But I guess the biggest thing in answer to your question, if it, looking back on it, is one, realizing it's a good possibility that may happen, and two, making sure that you kind of preempt that next conversation with some additional information, start building up that rapport, prior to that conversation, so that you just have a chance to move a little faster. Because now we're just that much further behind the eight ball, which wouldn't be a big deal, except we're so seasonal. Like we're going to miss half the season, before we could even begin to get product to them at this point, just because of where we are.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, from the buyer's perspective too, I would just add, if you think about it, put yourself in their shoes for a second. I mean, they're having these, calls and meetings day in and day out, and you're probably, the third product they talk to that day, and probably the 100th product that they're going to talk to this month.
Absolutely.
And I think just having the right expectations of going into it, as far as, you are one of many, many products and brands that they're talking to see what's the best fit for that, very limited shelf space that they have.
And try not to be just one of many, right? Like, I mean,
right.
Try to be a standout, I think that's, if there's nothing else that I would take away from that and from this process is, don't be just another me too out of the 100 that he's going to talk to this month, because otherwise the chances of A, you even getting another meeting with them, or B, getting on the shelf is probably pretty slim. So, making sure A, that you've got a really good differentiator for your product, because if you're really just another me too, yeah, maybe you get on the shelf, but then, do you actually sell? If you're a me too, if they've already got 5 products, on the shelf of that type, and you're just another me too, then the only thing you really got to do is compete on price. And then again, it's a race to the bottom. Is your product actually going to sell? And if it doesn't, then here we are, like you're buying the product back and you're shipping it back and you're doing whatever you're going to do. So again, we're back to differentiate, make sure you have a solid brand, you have some serious USP versus other brands in your category, so that you do stand out among those 100 that he's going to see this month. And maybe he chooses you to be the one on the shelf.
Yeah. Well, and I would add to that, I mean, also just have your basic blocking and tackling, in the sense of, understanding how the wholesale process works, understanding, being responsive to what they need, and kind of anticipating what they're going to be looking for in that process. Because again, I hate to say it, but they're talking with 100 brands a month. And the reality of it is that probably, 50, 60, 70 of those aren't very organized. And,
right.
Just having your blocking and tackling, if you can combine that with exactly what you're talking about, Mike, of having a really strong, unique selling proposition, you're already ahead of the game, and you're going to beat out 95 out of those 100 people that they talk to that month.
Yeah, for sure. I think too that one of the benefits of going with the agency, route, as opposed to trying to pull it off yourself, is, back on that same point, like they know how to talk to that buyer. They know the things that buyer is going to want to know. They know the things that you're going to have to do. And so they can walk you through that process in such a way that, at least when you're having those conversations with the buyer, you don't sound like a complete idiot, because one of two things is going to happen in that scenario. If you do sound like you have no idea what you're talking about and you've never done this before, either A, they're going to decide not to work with you at all because you don't know what you're doing and your product is another me too. It's just like everybody else. So why would we choose you? Or B, you do have an actual differentiator and you are something that they want to put on the shelf, but they recognize that you don't know what you're doing. And so you open the door to potentially being really taken advantage of in that scenario, because they assume you don't know, because you probably don't. And things are going to happen that you're not going to recognize. And all of a sudden you're in a hole. And I'm not saying is going to do that. They seem like a pretty straightforward company, but the reality is there certainly are buyers out there who would if they thought they could. So,
Well, it may not be intentional either. I mean, at the end of the day, they don't know exactly what your margins are, or what your processes are, or, all those types of things. They don't know your business as well as you do. So, and the buyer works for the company. So they're going to
Yeah.
make sure that, their interests are taken care of first. And it may not be intentional, but it may be something where if you're not, if you don't really know your numbers or, what's all involved, you may be committing yourself to selling a ton of product at a loss.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, you have to be prepared to negotiate. That's one of those skills that that'll take you far in life in a lot of different places, is being able to negotiate. And that's certainly one of them. I mean, if they sense any sort of weakness going into that conversation, it's their job to take advantage of that and get the best deal for the company, because they work for the company. And their goal
Right.
their job is to get the product for as cheap as they can.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, again, think about it from that buyer's perspective. I mean, their job is challenging enough of finding, products they're going to sell on the shelf. The last thing that they want to do is have to, train another train another brand on how to sell, how to do their job and how to sell.
Right. Yeah, they don't have time for that. I mean, like you said, you're one of 100 brands they're going to talk to this month, if not more. They don't have the time for that. That's no matter how much they might like your product, they're not going to want to be put through the ringer like that. If they bring somebody in that they think knows what they're doing, that's you're way ahead of the game. So, and
All right.
that's as far as we are in the process at this point. So I mean, that's the kind of stuff that we're learning as we go. I've never done it before, so I'm pretty much a newbie at this. So, but as the process progresses, I'm happy to discuss it as we learn new things and kind of walk people through that process. But
Okay. Yeah. I think this is fantastic for, listeners, especially as they think about, adding new channels. So being a Tactics Tuesday episode, what's maybe, one big takeaway that you'd give for listeners as they're thinking about kind of brick and mortar and going the wholesale route?
I honestly could not give a better takeaway than one that we harp on constantly, but that is margins. You got to be selling at a premium price point. Don't be fighting, for the lowest price in your category, because you just limit yourself too much. There's too many things that can happen that can put you out of business, and it certainly puts you in a position where retail is not really an option. And I would also say this: so moving into retail is a stepping stone. Like if you're looking at a potential exit for your business, like if you're already on the shelf at retail and like you said, if it's money in the mailbox, right? Like you've already set up their relationship, they're already buying product. Like for a buyer, that's gold, because that's guaranteed money essentially. As long as they maintain that account and they don't screw something up, that's money they can count on coming in the door, every single month. So it adds to your valuation to be able to get onto the retail, shelves. And if you get on one store, there's a pretty good chance you can get onto other store shelves, because that's the proof right here. We're already in this store. They're just like you. They're selling product. Why can't we be on your shelf too? So, and so going backwards, margin is key. If you've got that margin, you have that door open to you. If you don't have the margin, the door's closed.
All right. Yeah, I think that's a good takeaway for our listeners. Matt, anything else that you want to add before we wrap up?
No, I mean, I love how we always end up on the same roads, almost at the end of every episode, and having, margins. I like my margins big, and I hate the race to the bottom. And so this is just another argument for that case. So.
All right. Well, thank you everybody for listening to this Amazon Tactics Tuesday. Today we covered something a little bit different, talking about wholesale. And Mike, I appreciate you sharing that journey. And listeners out there, be thinking about how you can improve your margins, as that is a huge strategic advantage as you look at fortifying your brand, whether it be on Amazon or you start reaching out into some of these other channels like brick and mortar.